"Oh, honey, are you sure this is your seat? The signs can be a little confusing, I know." The flight attendant's smile was a perfect predatory curve, her voice dripping with a sweetness so artificial it could give you a toothache. She gestured vaguely towards the back of the plane, a dismissive flick of her wrist. "Economy is just down that way. I'm sure you'll find your friends there." Her eyes raked over the black teenager in the plush first-class seat, dismissing his designer hoodie and expensive noise-cancelling headphones as either fake or stolen. She thought she was just putting a kid in his place. She had no idea she wasn't just talking to a passenger. She was talking to the son of the man who could buy the very plane she was standing on. The hum of the Boeing 777 was a familiar lullaby to Marcus Thorne. At 17, he had more air miles than most seasoned business travelers. His life was a curated series of departures and arrivals, a rhythm dictated by his father's global empire. This flight, American Airlines 100 from JFK to London Heathrow, was supposed to be a simple commute, a transition from a week of visiting his mother in New York to rejoining his father in their London penthouse for the remainder of the summer. He settled into seat 1A, the prime real estate of the first-class cabin, pulling the soft fabric of his Fear of God hoodie over his head and queuing up a lo-fi playlist on his state-of-the-art headphones. He was cocooned in his world, observing the last-minute ballet of boarding, the frantic rustle of bags being hoisted into overhead bins, the hushed, important-sounding phone calls, the polite murmurings of a cabin designed for comfort and discretion. He was used to the looks. He was a young black man, dressed in the casual, logo-driven luxury that was the uniform of his generation, sitting in a seat that cost more than the average monthly salary. The initial double-takes from fellow passengers were predictable. Most were fleeting, a quick assessment, followed by a return to their own affairs. They saw the quiet confidence, the ease with which he occupied the space, and their curiosity subsided. But then came the flight attendant. Her name tag read Karen Peterson. She looked to be in her late 40s with blonde hair pulled into a severe tight bun that seemed to stretch the skin around her eyes. A faint web of wrinkles fanned out from their corners, creases not of laughter but of perpetual disapproval. She moved through the cabin with an air of beleaguered authority, as if the plane were her personal kingdom, and every passenger an unruly subject. When her eyes landed on Marcus, they narrowed for a fraction of a second. It was a micro-expression of appraisal and dismissal, one Marcus had seen 1,000 times before. She bypassed the older businessman in 1B and the well-dressed couple across the aisle, making a beeline for him. Her shadow fell over his open laptop. "Can I help you?" She asked, the words polite, but the tone laced with something sharp and accusatory. Marcus slid his headphones down around his neck. "I'm sorry." "Your seat," she said, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on the armrest. "I just need to see your boarding pass. We have to verify everyone is in their correct assigned seating." It was a lie, and they both knew it. No one else had been asked. Marcus, however, had been coached by his father, Robert Thorne, since he was old enough to travel alone. Never lose your cool, son. The moment you show anger, they win. Be polite, be firm, and document everything. He calmly reached into his travel wallet, retrieved the crisp paper of his boarding pass, and handed it to her. Her eyes scanned it, searching for a flaw, a discrepancy, anything to validate her suspicion. The name, Marcus Thorne. The seat, 1A. The class, first. A flicker of disappointment crossed her face before being replaced by that saccharine, condescending smile. It was then she delivered her opening salvo. "Oh, honey, are you sure this is your seat?" "The signs can be a little confusing, I know." She gestured vaguely towards the back of the plane. "Economy is just down that way. I'm sure you'll find your friends there." The insult was designed to be both public and deniable. She wasn't just questioning his ticket, she was questioning his entire presence, his right to exist in this space. She was implying he was lost poor and belonged with his friends, a thinly veiled racial stereotype. The businessman in 1B, a portly man in a rumpled suit, glanced over his expression, unreadable. Across the aisle, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and a tailored blazer paused, her reading, her attention captured. Marcus felt the familiar hot flush of anger, but he pushed it down, turning it into a cold, hard stone in his gut. He met Karen's gaze, his own expression unyieldingly neutral. "My pass says 1E. He stated simply, his voice steady. "The sign above my head says 1A. I'm quite sure I'm in the right place. Perhaps you're the one who is confused." The polite challenge hung in the air. Karen's smile tightened the sweetness, curdling at the edges. She had expected him to be intimidated to stammer or become defensive. His composure irked her. "Well," she huffed, handing back the pass as if it were contaminated. "We sometimes have last-minute upgrades and ticketing changes. I'll just have to double-check the manifest." She turned and marched toward the galley, her back ramrod straight. She hadn't won the first skirmish, and that only fueled her resolve. Marcus watched her go before sliding his headphones back on. But he didn't press play. He sat in silence, the quiet hum of the cabin now filled with a different kind of tension. He knew this wasn't over. For flight attendant Karen Peterson, this had just become a personal mission. The flight to London was long, and she had hours to make his journey a living hell. The woman across the aisle, Amelia Hayes, gave him a small, sympathetic nod before returning to her book. It was a silent acknowledgement that she had seen and understood the exchange. For Marcus, it was a small comfort. He pulled out his phone and sent a quick encrypted text to his father's chief of staff, Jessica. "Minor turbulence on AAL100 before takeoff. Just a heads up." It was their code. It meant he was facing a situation, but he had it under control. For now. The 777 leveled off at 35,000 feet, a silver dart slicing through the dark Atlantic sky. The cabin lights dimmed, and the curated theater of first-class service began. Hot towels were distributed, champagne was poured, and artisanal nut bowls were placed on linen cocktail napkins. For everyone but Marcus. Karen Peterson orchestrated his exclusion with a passive-aggressive artistry that was almost impressive in its pettiness. When she offered hot towels, her tongs seemed to skip right over him. When the champagne trolley rolled by, she engaged the man in 1B in a long, detailed conversation about the vintage, effectively creating a conversational barrier that made it impossible for Marcus to get her attention until she had moved past his row. Marcus didn't react. He read his book, a dense volume on architectural theory, and made a point of not looking needy. He knew what she was doing. It was a war of attrition. She wanted him to complain, to become loud or belligerent, to give her the ammunition she needed, to label him as the angry black man. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Amelia Hayes, the lawyerly woman in 2C, watched with growing indignation. She saw the deliberate snubs, the way Karen's back was always turned to Marcus, the overly solicitous attention she paid to every other passenger. The first major move came during the meal service. "And for you, sir," Karen said, her voice booming with false cheer as she addressed the passenger in 1B. "The pan-seared halibut with a lemon caper sauce, or the filet mignon with a red wine reduction." After taking his order, she turned to Marcus, her order pad conspicuously absent. "I'm afraid there's been a mix-up with the catering," she said loud enough for the front of the cabin to hear. "We don't seem to have a first-class meal catered for your seat. I can probably get you one of the chicken or pasta options from business class if they have any left over." The implication was clear. His ticket was fraudulent, a ghost in the system. He didn't belong, and therefore he didn't deserve to eat. This was the moment Marcus chose to push back, but gently. "That's strange," he said, closing his book but keeping his finger in the page. "I pre-ordered my meal 2 days ago. The filet mignon medium rare. Could you please double-check the confirmation email is on my phone if you need to see it?" His response was so reasonable, so devoid of anger, that it cornered her. She was trapped by procedure. To refuse to check would be a blatant dereliction of duty. "Fine." She snapped her mask of politeness, finally cracking. She stomped back to the galley. A few minutes later, Ben, a younger, nervous-looking flight attendant, appeared at Marcus's side. "Mr. Thorne," Ben asked quietly, avoiding eye contact. "I am so sorry about that confusion. Here is your filet mignon." He placed the meal before Marcus, the plate clattering slightly from his trembling hands. "Can I get you anything to drink with that? A sparkling water? A soda?" "Sparkling water would be great. Thank you, Ben," Marcus said, making sure to use his name. The young man looked relieved and scurried away. From the galley, Marcus could hear Karen hissing at Ben, her words indistinct, but her tone venomous. The meal was a small victory, but Karen was not one to accept defeat. Her next attack was more direct. As she collected the dinner plates, she stumbled near Marcus's seat. A half-empty glass of red wine, taken from another passenger's tray, sloshed over the side, splashing onto the sleeve of Marcus's cream-colored hoodie. "Oh my goodness, look at that!" she exclaimed, her voice thick with faux horror. "You really should be more careful with your things." She blamed him, as if his arm had reached out and magically attracted the wine. She made a half-hearted attempt to dab at the stain with a napkin, only succeeding in smearing it further into the expensive cotton. Marcus looked down at the dark red stain, then back up at her. He said nothing. The silence was more damning than any accusation. Amelia Hayes had seen enough. "That was completely uncalled for," she said, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the cabin's quiet. "I saw that. You did that deliberately." Karen rounded on her. "Ma'am, I can assure you it was an accident. This passenger was shifting in his seat. He was sitting perfectly still, reading a book." Amelia countered her tone, leaving no room for argument. "I've been a premier status flyer with this airline for 15 years, and I have never witnessed such unprofessional and targeted harassment of a passenger. I want your name and your employee number." Panic flared in Karen's eyes. A complaint from a high-status frequent flyer was serious, but instead of backing down, she chose to escalate, seeing Marcus as the root cause of her problems. If she could remove him, she could perhaps silence the complaint. It was a desperate, foolish gamble. She drew herself up to her full height. "Ma'am, this is a matter of cabin safety and security. This passenger has been a source of disruption since he boarded." It was a wild, baseless accusation. "And frankly," she said, turning her full venomous attention back to Marcus, "we've been looking for a place to seat a federal air marshal who needs to be moved. For security reasons, we need this seat. Young man, I am no longer asking. I am instructing you to gather your belongings and move to the economy seat we have found for you. It's 34E. This was it. The final outrageous demand. She wasn't just being a petty bully anymore. She was invoking security, manufacturing, a federal issue to get her way. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. The cabin was now silent, all eyes on the drama unfolding in row 1. The businessman in 1B stared open-mouthed. Ben peeked out from the galley, his face pale with horror. Marcus looked at Karen, then at Amelia, offering her a small, grateful smile. He then turned his gaze back to Karen. He remained preternaturally calm. "No," he said, his voice quiet but firm as steel. "I will not be moving. My ticket is for seat 1A. I have done nothing wrong. If you continue to harass me, I will be the one filing a report. In fact," he added, pulling out his phone, "I think I'll just clarify the situation with the person who booked this ticket for me. I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear about the service on this flight." Karen let out a short, sharp laugh. "And who would that be?" "Your mommy, go ahead and call. There's nothing anyone can do. Now are you going to move, or am I going to have the captain get involved?" "Oh, I don't think you'll need the captain," Marcus said, his fingers dancing across the screen of his phone. "But he might want to get involved in a little while." He typed out a new message. It was short, direct, and would set in motion a chain of events that would bring one of the world's busiest airports to a grinding halt. The message was to his father, Robert Thorne. It contained only 3 words: Code Red, AAL100. Robert Thorne was in a glass-walled boardroom on the 50th floor of a skyscraper in Canary Wharf, London. The view was a glittering panorama of the city, but the mood inside was tense. He was in the final brutal stages of a hostile takeover of a rival firm, a multi-billion-dollar chess match that had consumed him for weeks. His top lieutenants sat around the mahogany table, their faces illuminated by the glow of spreadsheets and legal documents on their laptops. Robert, a man whose presence filled any room, was a study in controlled intensity. Dressed in a bespoke Savile Row suit, he exuded an aura of absolute power, his every word precise, his every gesture deliberate. His personal phone, a hardened, encrypted device that only a handful of people had the number for, vibrated on the table. He glanced down. The sender ID was simply M. The message, Code Red, AAL100. The blood in Robert Thorne's veins turned to ice. The room fell silent. His team knew the look on his face. The cold, focused fury that had dismantled corporations and brought competitors to their knees was now directed at an unknown target. He had established the codes with Marcus years ago, a protocol for a boy growing up in a world where his skin color and his family's wealth made him a target. Minor turbulence was for annoyances. Code Red was for threats. It was a signal that Marcus was in a situation he could not de-escalate on his own, one that was actively hostile and potentially dangerous. Without a word, Robert Thorne stood up, ending the high-stakes meeting as if swatting away a fly. "Jessica," he said, his voice dangerously calm. His chief of staff, a woman renowned for her unflappable efficiency, was already on her feet. "Sir, get me the CEO of American Airlines on the line, now. Not his assistant, not his deputy, him, and patch him through to the car. We're leaving." He turned to his legal team. "The deal is on hold. Draw up the paperwork for a full withdrawal. Cite unforeseen circumstances." The lawyers and executives exchanged shocked glances. To pause a deal of this magnitude over a text message was unthinkable, but no one questioned him. "Track AL100 out of JFK," Robert commanded, as he strode out of the room, Jessica trailing him with a phone already pressed to her ear. "I want its exact position, speed, and estimated arrival time at Heathrow. Get me the head of Heathrow operations and the director of UK air traffic control. Conference them in on a separate line." They were in the private elevator, plunging silently towards the ground floor when Jessica spoke. "I have David Harrison, CEO of American Online One, sir. He sounds confused." Robert took the phone. "David," he said, dispensing with pleasantries. "This is Robert Thorne. I have a son, Marcus Thorne, on your flight, AAL100 in seat 1A. He has just sent me a distress signal. He is being harassed by a member of your crew. I need you to understand me very clearly. My family's holding company, Thorne Industries, is one of your largest corporate clients. We spend over $30 million a year with your airline. I am telling you now that if my son is not treated with the dignity and respect he is owed, if this situation is not rectified immediately, you will not see another dollar from us. Furthermore, I will personally fund a class action lawsuit against your airline for discriminatory practices that will make your quarterly losses look like a rounding error." The line was silent for a moment. The CEO, likely roused from a late dinner, was processing the sudden catastrophic complaint from one of his most valuable customers. "Robert, I'm shocked to hear this," Harrison stammered. "I can assure you we'll look into it immediately. I can have the captain—" "You will do more than look into it," Robert interrupted, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You will listen. The flight attendant's name is Karen Peterson. She is to have no further contact with my son for the remainder of the flight. Is that understood?" "Yes, of course." "Good. That is the first step. The second step will take place upon landing." By now they had reached the basement garage, where a black Maybach was waiting, its engine purring. Robert slid into the plush leather interior. "Jessica status on Heathrow," he barked. "Director Jennings from Nats and Head of Operations, Miller from Heathrow, on line 2, sir. They are awaiting your instructions." Robert switched lines. "Gentlemen, this is Robert Thorne. My Gulfstream G700 tail number N901RT is currently parked in a private hangar at your facility. I need it moved." "Mr. Thorne, of course," came the voice of the Heathrow operations head. "Where are you flying to? We can have it fueled and ready." "I'm not flying anywhere," Robert said coldly. "I want you to have my pilots taxi the jet onto the primary landing runway for incoming transatlantic flights. I want them to position it in a way that blocks all inbound traffic from that direction. Specifically, I want it to block the arrival of AAL100. There was a stunned silence on the line. The request was insane. It was a logistical nightmare, a security breach, and an act that could cost millions in delays and snarl air traffic over Western Europe. Mr. Thorne," the air traffic controller stammered. "That is impossible. It's a major breach of aviation protocol. We can't simply block a live runway. You can," Robert corrected him, "and you will. Thorne Industries is a primary investor in the Heathrow expansion project, and we have several pending infrastructure contracts with the UK Department for Transport. I am certain that if you review your agreements, you will find a clause for emergency logistical considerations. This is one such emergency. If you refuse, I will not only pull our investment, but I will make a call to the Transport Minister and have your professional conduct reviewed at the highest level. The choice is yours. A temporary controlled disruption managed by me, or a catastrophic career-ending political incident managed by others." It was corporate blackmail of the highest order, wielded with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. He was leveraging his immense power, not just his wealth, but his political and industrial influence. The men on the other end of the line were cornered. A few minutes of logistical chaos versus a professional and political firestorm. They folded. "We understand, Mr. Thorne. We will coordinate with your pilot." The director finally conceded, his voice strained. Robert hung up. He looked out the window as the Maybach sped through the empty nighttime streets of London towards the airport. He had just held one of the world's largest airlines and busiest airports hostage. He felt no remorse. Someone had threatened his son. The world would now stop and wait until he said it could move again. Aboard AAL100, Marcus felt the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere. Karen Peterson, who had been glaring at him from the galley, was suddenly called to the cockpit. She was gone for nearly 10 minutes. When she returned, her face was ashen. The smug superiority was gone, replaced by a raw, naked fear. She didn't look at Marcus. She didn't look at anyone. She went straight to the galley and began rattling dishes with trembling hands. Ben, the junior attendant, now handled all service in the first-class cabin, treating Marcus with the deference one might reserve for royalty. The other passengers noticed. Whispers rippled through the seats. What had the boy on the phone done? Who had he called? Marcus simply reopened his architecture book. He knew his father. The problem was being handled. He didn't know the specifics, but he knew the response would be decisive. He just had to wait for the landing. The descent into London was smooth. The first hint of dawn was breaking over the horizon, painting the cloud cover in shades of orange and purple. The familiar chime sounded through the cabin, followed by the captain's voice. "Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As we begin our final descent into London, Heathrow, please ensure your seat backs and tray tables are in their full upright position, and that all carry-on luggage is stowed. Cabin crew, please prepare for landing." The announcement was routine, but the captain's voice was tight, strained. Karen Peterson moved through the cabin like an automaton, her face a pale, grim mask. She checked seatbelts and collected stray cups, her movements jerky and robotic. She studiously avoided making eye contact with anyone in the first-class section, especially Marcus. The plane banked the sprawling geometry of London's suburbs emerging from the morning mist. The wheels deployed with a satisfying thud, and the aircraft lined up for its final approach. Passengers could see the runway lights rushing up to meet them. Then something was wrong. Instead of the gentle flare and touchdown, the engines suddenly roared back to life. The plane surged upwards, climbing steeply in a go-around procedure. A collective gasp went through the cabin. Go-arounds were not common, and they always set people on edge. The captain came back on the intercom, his voice now laced with undisguised stress. "Apologies for that, folks. A minor issue on the runway. Air traffic control has instructed us to circle. We'll keep you updated." They circled for 20 minutes, then 30. Passengers grew restless. Business travelers checked their watches, their important meetings in the city now in jeopardy. Finally, the plane lined up again. This time it landed smoothly. But as it slowed and turned off the runway onto a taxiway, it didn't proceed to the terminal. It stopped. And it stayed stopped. For a long, silent 10 minutes, the captain's voice returned, and this time it was devoid of all professional calm. It was the voice of a man in an impossible situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have an announcement to make, and I ask for your patience and understanding. Our assigned gate, and indeed all gates in this terminal, are currently blocked. We are being held on the tarmac due to an unscheduled aircraft movement. A private jet has been positioned in a way that is preventing our access to the terminal." A murmur of disbelief and frustration swept through the plane. A private jet blocking a 737. How was that even possible? It sounded like something out of a movie. Karen Peterson stood frozen near the galley. Her breathing was shallow. She knew. Somehow she knew this was connected to the boy in 1A. The call to the cockpit had been a cryptic warning from the airline's own operations center, relayed from the CEO himself. "Do not engage with the passenger in 1A under any circumstances. Await further instructions upon landing. This is a Level 1 priority issue." She had never even heard of a Level 1 priority. Marcus looked out his window, and there it was, sleek, black, and impossibly arrogant. A Gulfstream G700 sat parked at a precise 90-degree angle across the main taxiway leading to Terminal 5. It wasn't an accident. It was a statement. It was a blockade. On its tail, illuminated by the flashing lights of a nearby airport vehicle, was the registration number, N9999RT, Robert Thorne. Amelia Hayes, the lawyer, followed his gaze. She saw the jet saw the registration, and then looked back at Marcus, who was watching the scene with a calm, almost detached interest. A slow smile of comprehension spread across her face. "Well, I'll be," she whispered to herself. "That's one way to file a complaint." A black SUV, the kind used by diplomatic services, drove across the tarmac and pulled up beside the 737. The cabin door was opened, not by the ground crew, but by the captain himself. He walked down the jet bridge, which had been hastily connected, and met with two men in dark suits who emerged from the SUV. After a brief tense conversation, the captain walked back onto the plane, his face pale and set. He strode past the economy and business class cabins, his focus singular. He stopped at the front row, his eyes locking not on Marcus, but on Karen Peterson. "Karen," he said, his voice low, but carrying the weight of finality. "Gather your things. You need to come with me." Her jaw trembled. "Captain? What is this? What's going on?" "The owner of that jet," the captain said, gesturing out the window toward the defiant Gulf Stream, "has requested a meeting with you, with us. Mr. Robert Thorne has made it a non-negotiable condition for him to move his aircraft and allow this airport to resume normal operations." The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Robert Thorne, the titan of industry, the billionaire whose company logo was on half the buildings in Canary Wharf. Every passenger in first class and many in business recognized the name, and in an instant they all understood. The quiet black kid in the hoodie, the condescending flight attendant, the blocked runway. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Karen Peterson's face crumpled, the carefully constructed facade of authority, the bitterness, the petty tyranny, it all dissolved into pure abject terror. This was not a customer complaint that would result in a note in her file. This was a career-ending, life-altering cataclysm she had brought upon herself. She had picked a fight with a god of the corporate world, and he had responded by stopping time itself just to have a word with her. "Me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He wants to see me." "Yes," the captain confirmed, his expression grim. "He wants to discuss the treatment of his son." The walk from the plane felt like a mile. For Karen Peterson, it was a slow-motion nightmare. Every eye in the first and business class cabins was on her as she was escorted down the aisle by the grim-faced captain. The whispers followed her like a rustling tide, a mixture of shock, contempt, and a certain grim satisfaction. The woman who had wielded her minor authority like a weapon was now being marched to her own execution. As she stepped out of the airplane and onto the jet bridge, the morning air felt cold and sharp. The roar of another plane's engines in the distance sounded like a mournful howl. At the bottom of the stairs, on the solid, unforgiving asphalt of the tarmac, stood Robert Thorne. He was not what she expected. There was no shouting, no theatrical rage. He stood perfectly still beside the open door of his Maybach, dressed in the same immaculate suit he'd worn in his boardroom. He was flanked by Jessica and another man who radiated the quiet menace of a seasoned security chief. But all of that faded into the background. The full force of Karen's attention was drawn to Robert Thorne's eyes. They were the color of slate, and they held a cold, terrifying calm, the dispassionate gaze of a predator that has its prey cornered and knows there is no escape. The captain, a man used to being in command, seemed diminished in Thorne's presence. He began to speak, his voice strained. "Mr. Thorne, I am Captain Miller. On behalf of American Airlines, I want to offer my most profound..." Robert held up a single hand, and the captain's words died in his throat. He did not look at the captain. He did not look at the airline supervisor who had scurried over from the terminal. His entire undivided attention was fixed on Karen. "You are Karen Peterson," he stated. It was not a question. She could only nod her throat too tight to form words. "You demanded my son move from the seat I paid for," he continued, his voice low, and even yet it cut through the noise of the airfield. "You accused him of being disruptive. You deliberately spilled a drink on him. And you did all of this because you looked at a young black man in a first-class seat and decided he didn't belong there." Each sentence was a nail hammered into her coffin. He knew everything. Every slight, every condescending word, every petty act of malice. It was a misunderstanding." She stammered the words, feeble and pathetic even to her own ears. "The manifest security protocols." "Do not lie to me," Robert said, his voice dropping another register, becoming something truly frightening. "I have a sworn statement being drafted right now by another passenger in that cabin, a partner at a London law firm detailing your every action. I have the logs from the airline's own internal communication system. I have my son's word. And you," he said, taking a single step forward, "have nothing." He turned his gaze to the airline supervisor. "This woman is to be terminated. Immediately. I don't mean suspended, and I don't mean reassigned. I mean fired. Her employee credentials revoked before she steps off this tarmac. Her final paycheck will be mailed to her. Is that clear?" The supervisor, a man named Henderson, swallowed hard. "Mr. Thorne, there are HR procedures, union rules." "There are not," Robert countered, "because my $30 million corporate account is also a procedure. And that procedure is about to be terminated. Your stock will take a hit in the morning when the markets open. David Harrison has already been instructed to expect my call. You can either follow your procedure and deal with that fallout, or you can fire this one employee who has exposed your company to a lawsuit that will cost you 10 times her salary. This is your only offer." Henderson's professional courage evaporated. He looked at Karen with pity, but also with the cold calculation of a man saving his own skin. "We understand, Mr. Thorne. Her employment with American Airlines is terminated effective immediately." Karen let out a small, choked sob. Her career, her identity for the past 25 years had just been erased on a patch of concrete. But Robert wasn't finished. "Her termination is only the beginning," he said, his gaze sweeping back to the captain and the supervisor. "I expect a formal public apology from the airline. Not to me, but to my son. I expect a complete overhaul of your diversity and anti-discrimination training to be overseen by a third-party firm of my choosing at your expense. And I expect a multi-million-dollar donation to a charity that supports underprivileged students of color. My assistant, Jessica, will provide you with a list of acceptable organizations. You will do all of this, or the story of how American Airlines allows its staff to racially profile the children of its top clients will be on the front page of every major newspaper by noon. Jessica has already drafted the press release." It was a total unconditional surrender he was demanding. He wasn't just punishing the individual. He was punishing the system that allowed her to flourish. Just then, Marcus appeared at the top of the jet bridge. He had his backpack slung over his shoulder and was holding his stained hoodie in his hand. He walked down the stairs and came to stand beside his father. He looked at Karen not with triumph or anger, but with a quiet, weary disappointment. Robert put a hand on his son's shoulder. His expression softened fractionally as he looked at Marcus. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Dad," Marcus said. Robert looked back at the defeated crew. "My son is fine because he is strong, because I taught him how to endure this world's ugliness with grace. A lesson your airline has clearly failed to teach its own staff." He nodded to his pilot, who was watching from the cockpit of the Gulf Stream. A moment later, the jet's engine spooled up. Robert turned his back on Karen and the airline officials, guiding Marcus towards the Maybach. "Jessica," he said over his shoulder, "get Miss Amelia Hayes's contact information from 2C. I want to send her a thank you, and see if her firm is interested in a retainer from Thorne Industries." As the Maybach door closed, sealing them in its silent, luxurious cabin, the sleek, black Gulf Stream began to move. It glided smoothly off the taxiway, its defiance dissolving as its purpose was served. The blockade was over. The world could start moving again. But for Karen Peterson, standing alone on the tarmac, as the Boeing 777 she used to rule finally lumbered towards the gate, everything had come to a permanent, grinding halt. The news cycle was brutal. It started not as a press release from Thorne Industries. Robert Thorne had no need for that, now that his demands were being met, but as a viral video. A passenger in business class had discreetly filmed the captain's final announcement about the private jet and the subsequent walk of shame. The video, combined with tweets from other passengers, including a detailed thread from Amelia Hayes, created a perfect storm of public outrage. American Airlines went into full damage control. Within hours, their CEO, David Harrison, issued a public statement. It was a masterclass in corporate groveling. He offered a deep and unreserved apology to Marcus Thorne, announced the immediate termination of the employee involved, and pledged the very same multi-million-dollar donation and training overhaul that Robert Thorne had dictated on the tarmac. Thorne's name was never mentioned as the catalyst, but the speed and totality of the airline's capitulation told the real story to those in the know. For Karen Peterson, the aftermath was a swift and dizzying fall from grace. She was blacklisted in the commercial airline industry. Her name linked to the viral story made her unemployable. The flight attendants' union, faced with the irrefutable evidence and the colossal corporate pressure, quietly distanced themselves from her case. She lost her job, her travel privileges, and the pension she had been building for over 2 decades. Her friends in the industry stopped returning her calls. 6 months later, a local news outlet did a follow-up piece on the Heathrow hostage incident. They found Karen working as a cashier at a discount supermarket in a drab New Jersey suburb. The photo accompanying the article was devastating. The severe bun was gone, replaced by limp, unwashed hair. The imperious glare was replaced by a hollow, defeated emptiness in her eyes. The woman who had judged a boy based on the color of his skin was now invisible, swiping barcodes for minimum wage, a ghost in a world that had judged her back and found her wanting. There was no pity for her online, only a torrent of comments declaring that justice had been served. For the Thornes, life returned to its rarefied normal, but with a subtle shift. The incident had hardened something in Marcus. He continued his studies in architecture, but with a new focus on public spaces and inclusive design. He told his father he wanted to build things, community centers, libraries, schools where no one would ever be made to feel they didn't belong. Robert, proud, but also saddened by the catalyst, funded his son's preliminary projects with a newfound passion, establishing a charitable foundation in Marcus's name, dedicated to the cause. The story became a sort of legend in certain circles. For most, it was a satisfying tale of a racist getting her spectacular comeuppance. But for a few like Amelia Hayes, who occasionally had lunch with Jessica from Thorne Industries, it was more complex. It was a sobering reminder that in the face of systemic prejudice, true justice is often not delivered by the system itself. Sometimes it requires a person with enough power and wealth to grind the entire system to a halt and force it to listen. The scales of justice had been balanced, but only because Robert Thorne owned a set of scales big enough to outweigh an entire international airport. The incident on Flight AAL100 was over, but the quiet, everyday battles it represented continued in airports and cabins all over the world, usually without a billionaire's jet waiting on the runway. A year is both a long time and no time at all. For the world at large, the Heathrow hostage incident was a fleeting viral moment, a satisfying blip of drama consumed and forgotten. But for those at its epicenter, the event had sent out shockwaves that were still resonating subtly and profoundly, reshaping their lives long after the news cycle had moved on. The invoice for that day's events was not paid in a single transaction on the tarmac. It was being settled in daily ongoing installments of consequence and change. For Marcus Thorne, the invoice was paid in purpose. He was standing under the warm lights of a lecture hall at the Bartlett School of Architecture in London, arguably the best in the world. He was no longer the quiet boy in the hoodie, but a poised young man presenting his capstone project. On the large screen behind him were the renderings of his design, the Phoenix Centre, a community and arts hub for a deprived neighbourhood in South London. The core principle of this design is not just accessibility, but the concept of unconditional belonging. Marcus explained, his voice confident and clear. His audience of professors and fellow students listened captivated. It's about creating a space where the architecture itself communicates welcome. The entrance is wide and without barriers, physical or psychological. The sight lines are open, discouraging hidden corners where someone might feel marginalized or unsafe. The materials are warm, natural and tactile. The acoustics are designed to absorb harsh noise and promote calm conversation. Every single element is engineered to dismantle the question, "Do I belong here?" before it can ever form in a visitor's mind. His professor, a notoriously demanding architectural critic named Alistair Finch, peered at him over his spectacles. "It's an incredibly empathetic design, Mr. Thorne. Mature beyond your years. Most first-year students are obsessed with dramatic facades and personal ego. You seem to be obsessed with human dignity. What's your secret?" Marcus offered a small, knowing smile. "Let's just say I had a very memorable lesson in the hostile design of small spaces." He didn't need to say more. He had metabolized the poison of that day on Flight AAL100 and transformed it into an antidote. He rarely thought of Karen Peterson anymore. She was just a catalyst, a ghost, who had inadvertently handed him the lens through which he would now view his life's work. He wasn't building against her. He was building for every person who had ever been made to feel like an outsider. For Robert Thorne, the invoice was paid in perspective. He sat in his penthouse office overlooking the Thames, the same place where he had initiated his stunning display of power. Before him was a report from the newly established Thorne Foundation detailing the acquisition of the land for the Phoenix Centre. His son was not just designing it. He was with the foundation's backing, going to build it. Jessica stood by, holding a tablet. "The preliminary press on the project is overwhelmingly positive, sir. They're calling Marcus a prodigy." Robert stared at a photo in the report, a candid shot of Marcus laughing with a group of local teenagers during a community outreach day. "That day at Heathrow," Robert said, his voice quiet and reflective, "I used a sledgehammer to crack a nut. It was effective, it was necessary, but it was brutal." He looked at Jessica. "I forced a multi-billion-dollar corporation to its knees. I bought their obedience. It cost me nothing but a few phone calls." He tapped the photo of his son. "He is earning their respect. He is persuading them, inspiring them. His currency is vision, not intimidation. I'm beginning to realize which one has the more lasting value." It was a rare admission of the limits of his own power, a father's recognition that his son was forging a different and perhaps better path. For Karen Peterson, the invoice was paid in bitter daily increments of anonymity. She was on her break, sitting in a worn vinyl booth at a 24-hour diner that always smelled of stale coffee and grease. Her supermarket uniform was scratchy against her skin. She was scrolling through a news feed on her cheap smartphone when a familiar name caught her eye: Thorne. The article was about a new charitable foundation and its ambitious project to build a youth center. There was a picture of Marcus Thorne looking confident and praised. The old familiar acid of resentment burned in her throat. The injustice of it all. The Silver Spoon Kid handed everything. His father could stop the world from turning, and she couldn't even get a job with health benefits. It was his fault. All of it. She had just been doing her job maintaining standards, and he and his powerful father had destroyed her for it. The narrative was her shield, the story she told herself to survive the crushing humiliation of her new life. But today something was different. She read the quote from Marcus in the article, the one about unconditional belonging. The word snagged in her mind. Unconditional belonging. She thought of her walk into the supermarket each morning, the way her manager never looked her in the eye. She thought of the customers who spoke to her as if she were a piece of the machinery, the feeling of being utterly invisible, of not mattering. She thought of how she hurried home to her empty apartment, the silence, a heavy blanket. The feeling of not belonging. For the first time, a hairline crack appeared in the fortress of her self-pity. She wasn't feeling empathy for him, not yet. But she was, for a fleeting, terrifying moment, tasting the very same poison she had so casually administered to him. It was a dizzying, nauseating sensation. The vague, abstract concept of his humiliation was suddenly reflected back at her as a concrete, personal reality. She put the phone down her hand, trembling slightly. She stared into the murky depths of her cold coffee, her own reflection, staring back a stranger she no longer recognized. The reckoning on the tarmac had been public and swift, but the true judgment she was beginning to understand was this, a private, silent, and endless process of confronting the person she had become. And for the system itself, the invoice was paid in procedure. On a transatlantic American Airlines flight, Ben, the once nervous junior attendant, was now a senior crew member overseeing the first-class cabin. He moved with a quiet confidence that Karen Peterson had always mistaken for authority. A situation was brewing in row 3. A man in his 60s, dripping with old money and entitlement, was complaining loudly about the young woman in 3A. She was a tech founder, dressed in ripped jeans and a band t-shirt, her arms covered in colorful tattoos. "Her music is rattling my brain," the man complained to Ben, even though the woman was clearly wearing high-end earbuds. "People like that shouldn't be up here. It's disruptive." A year ago, Ben would have frozen. He would have looked to Karen for cues. Now he was the standard. He gave the complaining passenger a polite but firm smile. "I understand your concern, sir. Let me ensure all our passengers are comfortable." He didn't approach the woman with suspicion. He walked over and knelt slightly to be at her eye level. "Excuse me, miss. My name is Ben. Just doing my cabin check. Can I get you a refill on that water? Or perhaps a snack? I want to make sure you're having a pleasant flight." The woman smiled, pulling out an earbud. "I'm great, thanks, Ben. Appreciate you checking in." Ben nodded and returned to the galley. The complaining passenger glared at him. "Well, did you tell her to turn it down? The passenger in 3A is not in violation of any airline policy, sir," Ben stated calmly, his tone impeccably professional. "Her personal audio is not audible to others. Our first-class cabin is for all ticketed passengers. I am here to ensure everyone has a safe and comfortable flight, and I would appreciate it if you would allow me to do my job. Now can I get you another scotch?" The man, stunned by the polite but unyielding dismissal, simply slumped back in his seat and fell silent. Ben had not just averted a conflict, he had enforced a new culture. It was the Thorne mandate, now drilled into every employee in mandatory training sessions. It was quiet, it was unseen, but it was the most expensive invoice of all the price of changing a system, one passenger and one flight attendant at a time. And there you have it, a story that starts with a single venomous sentence and ends with an entire international airport brought to a standstill. It's a powerful reminder that the arrogance of prejudice can have staggering consequences, especially when it targets someone who, unbeknownst to the aggressor, has the power to fight back on a global scale. We've all seen or heard of moments like this, but rarely do they play out with such dramatic, life-altering force. What Karen Peterson thought was a simple act of putting someone in their place became the single act that dismantled her entire life. If this story of profound consequence and righteous justice resonated with you, please hit that like button to let us know. Share this video with someone who appreciates a story where the tables are turned in the most epic way possible. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. We have so many more incredible real-life dramas to share with you, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for watching.